I'm joined now by Chelsea Gordon. She's the Ruminant Technical Services Manager with Shur-Gain. And hey, out west might be struggling a lot to get the harvest in, but here in Ontario, we're facing a bit of a different issue. There are reports of some silage coming off with dangerously high mycotoxin levels. And so, Chelsea, welcome here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. So for farmers who are, I know silage harvest sort of got rolling, it maybe got hung up a little. We've got soybean harvest that sort of stalled out, but some of the sort of early indications are that we may have a mycotoxin problem in silage. So what's going on there? What are we worried about? Which mycotoxins specifically?
So kind of all of them, to be honest. Oftentimes when you get molds in silages, you're kind of getting a blend. Most often you have the fusarium types and Gabellas molds, which are producing Mycotoxins and zearalenone, and those are the ones that mostly we're testing for. So far this year in silages, from the early stuff that's come off, there would be a good indication that toxins are higher this year than they have been in the past. We're getting samples that are probably double of what we did last year for Mycotoxins. So if I look at the 2017 corn silage harvest year, for the samples that we tested, I'm getting probably a 1.7 ppm for corn silages. And this year already, I'm in the 3 ppm range. There is spots in different regions that would be higher than others, but for sure it's looking like a higher toxin year.
And so now, I mean, 1.7 doesn't sound like much. 3 is double that, but still doesn't sound super high, except for that is approaching a level we start to get concerned, right? So where sort of is that cutoff that you would be concerned about in feeding this as is?
So depending on who you talk to, you're going to get a different answer. With ruminants, they do have the rumen that can process a lot of these toxins and deal with them. So we tend not to be as worried about them as the monogastrics might be, but I'm starting to get concerned looking at that 2 to 3 range in the total TMR. So when we have things like corn silage, which we tend to feed quite a bit of, in addition to all the other grain and grain byproducts that we do see in TMRs, that's when you're getting into issues. So the corn silage harvest coming off first, we've got a good indication that there is toxins in the silage, which means that the corn is going to be higher in toxins as it stays out in the field. The potential for that toxins the molds continue to grow are there. And then when you get into the processed grain byproducts, the numbers can be even higher. So when you get talking about gluten feeds and distillers and things like that, you can get quite big ranges and quite an acceleration of the levels that we're seeing.
Right. Okay. So that was actually one of my questions for sure, is that certainly, I mean, silage is going to make up a huge part of a TMR, but then you add in grain, you add in those sorts of things. So I know that last winter there was a bit of concern with DDGs potentially having a slightly higher mycotoxin level. So what's your recommendation then for farmers? Should they be testing each individual component or working with their nutritionist to get their TMR put together and then testing that? Or what's the process there in figuring out, maybe where you've got the problem or a hot spot, or how you mix that in to stay under that parts per million that's really key?
Yeah, so I usually recommend testing the TMR because then you have a good idea of what's in everything. If you're having a high level in the TMR, then we have to get down to sources. So there's common sources in this year with knowing that corn's high, corn byproducts likely are going to be high as well. Making sure you're sourcing from a good place that has quality control measures in place. Try to avoid that really good buy, because chances are that's the higher Mycotoxin load byproducts that maybe some of the feed mills are rejecting. So making sure you know what you're getting for, and like I said, be cautious of that good deal. The other thing that you can do is working with your nutritionist to look at, if we've got it in your corn silage, we likely still need to feed it, but we can try to use it in places that are lower risk. So if we're having different groups, maybe not feeding to our high production cows who are probably a little bit more immune challenged to start with. And then looking at rumen function to make sure those toxins are not causing any dysfunction, making sure we have good immunity, so good mineral nutrition with good sources of those minerals, and then using potential toxin binders as well. The one caution I will make is there is too much of a good thing. A lot of these binders are non-specific, which is great when we have different combinations of binders so that we have a broad spectrum of toxins that we can bind. But in addition to that, we need to make sure that we're not overdoing it because they could be binding up other things.
Okay, so that is, now I will say there was, definitely some discussion last year with feed coming in that was a little high that, everyone's like, oh, you just feed a binder and it's fine. But I think that's a really key caution there that we can't fix all of these problems with just feeding a binder. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. We need to be controlling the amount that we're feeding these animals as well.
Okay. So now I did want to talk a little bit about, you did hit on it. That was one of my other questions, of course, as well is, depending on the animal we're feeding, and let's focus just on ruminants and maybe we stick with just dairy cows. But if we're speaking specifically on the dairy cow side, as you mentioned, perhaps, not, or really watching our levels for those high production cows or those cows in peak lactation. But does this have an impact, or can feeding something higher mycotoxins have an impact on, say, fertility in maybe some, either with heifers or with cows that you're trying to get rebred? Is there a caution there?
Absolutely. So depending on the type of toxin that you're seeing as well, this year, from the early indications, we are having a little bit of zearalenone as well. And zearalenone has kind of an estrogenic effect, which can have all sorts of issues with fertility too. So being cautious about those breeding age heifers for sure is important as well. The other thing that's another high risk group would be the young baby calves, because they're more of a monogastric in the way they're digesting things. So even the corn that we're feeding to the calves and calf starter is really important to make sure that it's a clean corn.
Okay. When does that change over, actually? That's maybe perhaps as an aside, and I tend to do these things, but when do we sort of start to treat calves as more of a ruminant than a monogastric?
So they're developing their rumen fairly early on, and depending different diet strategies, we can encourage growth faster. But I'd say I'd be cautious younger than 6 months. The rumens are starting to develop around that 4 months. But I'd be cautious younger than 6 months. Okay.
All right. So maybe just review for us what we can do, let's say, because of course, one of the things we can't control is we're past the point of preventing this happening in our corn crop or our silage crop out there. Now, of course, there is something we could do if you have crop out. This becomes very important to get that crop in and harvested and ensiled as quickly as possible. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. To
try and limit.
To try to stop that growth and as much as possible, getting rid of any of the junk and keeping that as clean as possible is also important.
All right. Okay. So let's get this crop in the field as soon as possible. Of course, now that was one of the questions I should have asked is what territory do you cover?
So I kind of travel all over Ontario. There is different areas that will be more or less affected. And a lot of it comes down to the toxins are prominently in the grain. So if we have a really, really high, really, really tall crop, proportionally, if we're still chopping at a normal height for corn silage, it may dilute that slightly. So if we look at more northern towards the Bruce area, that corn crop was fairly stunted in growth. However, they did still get the moisture around soaking time, and it was still a hot, humid summer. So I would still expect that they're likely going to see some toxins up there. For sure, we're definitely seeing it in more southern areas in Oxford County. And then the other thing, we've seen different amounts of smut potentially in more the eastern parts, it sounds like.
Okay, and what mycotoxin would be of concern there with smut, or is it just the
Sorry,
fungus itself?
you wouldn't see the fungus itself is not necessarily an issue, but any other disease or growth or insect damage or drought damage or any of those things just adds more stress to the plant, which makes it more susceptible to these molds for growth.
Right. Okay. All right. So definitely, if your silage is in, that's great. There's not much you can do there, but this is of course an indication then of what we should be watching for grain corn as it's coming in, whether high moisture corn, grain corn, whatever, as that comes in potentially for feed. Is this a bit of a yellow flag of what's to come, or in that, obviously the timing is slightly different on when silking happened and all those sorts of things, but is this a bit of a yellow flag for our grain corn crop as well?
Absolutely. It is. We should be watching grain corn coming in, and like I said, those byproducts from that grain corn.
Okay, absolutely. All right. Great advice, of course. A bit of a crash course there in if you aren't up on your mycotoxins, I hope everybody got a bit of a lesson today. So I do thank you so much, Chelsea, for joining us. Lots of good advice there. Tons of great reminders to, of course, get that crop in as quickly as you can. Get those feed tests done, work with your nutritionist, and maybe aim some of the higher mycotoxin level feed at your least vulnerable animals. Always a good tip of the hat there. So thank you so much, Chelsea, for that.